All right, welcome back. While we were away, there was another question. Once again, the question dealt with the husband and wife signing under what's called the tenants by the entirety. Yeah, there may have been there may be a out, finger quotes, for that because it wasn't a valid purchase agreement to begin with since the wife didn't sign it. I don't know if I would hang my hat on that being my sole defense, by the way. The contingency clause would have been my defense, all right? So let's talk about what a contingency is. And we use this word all the time in all facets of life. You've got contingency plans, you've got contingency activities, you've got all kinds of things that, well, if this happens, then we do this. If this doesn't happen, then we do this. So in general, a contingency is a condition or an action used in a contract to protect a party to the contract, okay? So if you're on the seller side, you would write a contingency in there. If you're on the buyer side, it would be trying to protect your buyer. Now, the contingency clause defines that condition or action that has to be met to make that contract binding to allow it to continue to moving forward. It's called positive progression towards closing. So there's a clause that has a contingency. That contingency has to be met for the purchase agreement to be in full force. A contingency becomes part of the contract when the parties agree and sign the contract. All right. Now, I say sign here because we're talking about real estate. Could have an oral contract outside of real estate. So I guess in general, if we're talking about a general, what? I'm sorry. Yeah, remember the statute of frauds. Real estate contracts have to be written, but there are other contracts in the world, not just real estate. You can have an oral contract. Indiana recognizes oral contracts. So here when I put parties agree, it could be just agree if it's an oral contract. I put agree and sign because we're going to talk about real estate, which works under the statute of frauds, which says it has to be in writing. Okay? So if a party agrees to a contingency, it becomes part of the contract that has to be fulfilled in that time is of the essence deadline. Now, you guys all remember time is of the essence, right? Question? What does time is of the essence mean? Time of the essence has nothing to do with the formation. This is a big misnomer that people have. When you write an offer and you say you're going to close by 45 days out, and then you give them 8 hours to answer, that 8 hours to answer is not the time of the essence portion. It's the termination of that contract. The close is in 45 days. That is just the time to respond to the offer, that 8 hours. So when our contracts say time is of the essence, it means that 45 days that we agreed to, whatever date you put, January, March, October, the contract must be closed by that date. That's what time is of the essence. If you go beyond that date of that you put in your purchase agreement, one or two of the parties may not be liable for their portion. That's why if you've ever had, right, exactly, she's got it. That's why if you've ever had a closing go by, you have to amend the purchase agreement to extend the date, because the title company doesn't want to close on the 7th if your time of the essence was on the 6th, because technically you're out of agreement, you're out of contract. So you amend, you call the other side and say, hey, we can't close Friday. And they're like, oh, we can't close either. Let's extend it to next Monday, and you amend the purchase agreement to change the time as of the essence date so that you're actually in contract. All right. Now, all that being said, all that has to be cleared so that you can close. And if you've got contingencies, then we have to clear them, and we'll talk about that. We inherently have a bunch of contingencies already. We typically use the appraisal contingency. If it doesn't appraise, we use a financing contingency if you're using a financing. What's the other contingency? There's a property inspection. We're going to talk literally about that one. All right. So a well-written contingency is one of the most powerful tools that you guys can use to protect your client. When it's written correctly, it will relieve the benefiting party any obligation to perform the balance of the contract without committing a breach. Now, I wrote that down, and I want you to understand what it says. What a contingency does, it allows you, your client, the ability to terminate let's use purchase agreement, ability to terminate the purchase agreement without committing a breach of the contract to do it. All right. So this contingency either is met or it's not met. If it's not met, then one of the conditions of the contract is not valid. Therefore, it gets undone, and you can't be sued for breach. Okay. Because the buyer usually requires information regarding the purchase, along with financing, appraisal, inspection. A well-written contingency allows necessary time to investigate matters. So you know, hey, I need 8 days. That's that contingency that we write when it says the report. We've got 15 days to have the inspection. Then we got 15 days to review it. Those are contingencies that say, hey, I've got to do it in this many days. If you don't meet that contingency, remember how it says the seller is assumed to accept it, or if you don't respond to the inspection in so many days, the buyer is assumed to accept the inspection report. That's a contingency. Now, that is one that is called a negative contingency, and we'll talk about it because it requires you to act to actually fulfill. If you fail to act, it actually becomes part of the contract. So that is inherently bad for a buyer. All right. And you guys all know sitting out there that you've done this. If your buyer fails to respond, he assumes to accept it. That is actually slighted towards the seller. Probably what we might want as buyers, of course, as selling agents with our buyers, we may want that to say, boy, if I fail to respond to the response, then that I'm assuming to not accept it. And then we would just get out. As a seller, you don't want that because that would just allow them to get out of the contract easy. But you understand how that contingency works. There's two sides of it. It can be a positive or a negative one, depending on what the outcome is for failure to respond. That's inherently what we're talking about here. Okay. The best manner to write a contingency clause is to make sure one of the key elements that most people leave out is this thing called a date certain. A date certain is a deadline. Like back in that one that we talked about at the beginning, subject to my wife's approval of the deal within 48 hours. Now, 48 hours is a relative term. Relative meaning it's 48 hours after the acceptance of the purchase agreement. You could also do an absolute by January the 2nd, where it gives an absolute date. Relative is probably the most common because it allows for them to take time to answer. If you give them 5 days and then you say your contingency is 48 hours after you accept the offer, well, if they accept it the first day, you got 48 hours. If they accept it the 5th day, you still got 48 hours. All right. So that's a relative kind of date certain that is relative to some action on their side. Whereas absolute says, here's my offer. It's good till the 5th of January or the 5th of July. Well, what happens if they're on vacation, don't see it till the 6th of July? Now you've already passed that time frame. So relative date certains or relative deadlines are probably the best way to use most of your contingencies. All right. Now, you also have to be reasonable. All right. And I know we're all laughing at that because what's reasonable to my side of the table may not be reasonable to your side of the table. You got to take into consideration what that contingency is. If you're writing a contingency subject to, somebody winning the Super Bowl, well, the Super Bowl is months away from now. So that deadline is not really reasonable. Of course, the other side of that coin is you don't want to pay, subject to my wife approving the deal within the next 10 minutes. That's not a reasonable time frame, and that was a stupid example, but I think you understand what I mean. You've got to take into the consideration of the purpose. If it's a response to an inspection and they have to get quotes from electricians and plumbers, you might make it 2 weeks. You don't want to make it 2 days because then all you're going to get is this inspection response that wants more time and blah, 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 blah. All right? Excuse me. We all doing okay so far? Oh, I love coffee. So, the anatomy of a contingency clause. A properly drafted contingency clause contains at least 3 questions. So when you're writing a contingency clause, you need to think about 3 different things. One is the action or. Who's the one doing the action? Is it the seller doing the action? Is it the buyer doing the action? You have to actually list what's the contingency. What are we actually talking about? Approval of my wife by my wife, as in that one. Approval of a plumber's report, maybe something. So you actually have to define that contingency. And then the third element that is important is that timeline. You got to have some kind of timeline to limit the response or effort. Question? Yeah, no. The question was, who decides the timeline? Well, obviously the timeline is decided by whoever's writing the contingency. So there are no state laws that say you got to give 5 days for this or 2 days for that or 8 days for that. And we go back to what I was just talking about. Here, let me scroll that back up. Contingency deadline should be reasonable. All right. So like I said, if you're trying to get a response from a certified electrician, subject to a certified electrician approving the wiring in this house within 7 days, because you've got to get an electrician, you got to call them, you got to make sure they got an opening, you got to get out there, they got to do a report, you got to read the report, respond to it. So the timeline is designed by whoever's writing the condition or the contingency, okay? There are key elements and how important they are to their client. Now, every element that you write should protect the creator of that contingency. All right? So if I'm on the selling side of this and we're going to write you an offer and I put a contingency in there, my contingencies obviously should protect my client, not your client. Your contingencies or counterbacks should protect your client. And there are key elements that we can write in these contingencies to make sure we actually do protect them. All right? Any questions? Nope. All right, let's move on to the next section.